Hello, welcome back to another video. This week I tried yet another student grade watercolor paper in a portrait study that thankfully had fewer unexpected issues compared to last week's. I'll be talking you through my process, my initial thoughts on the Fabriano Studio paper, and what I've learned from my first 3 months of trying traditional mixed media. The materials I used include Fabriano Studio watercolor hot press paper, Faber-Castell's 12 pencil Polychromos set, a Derwent pencil extender, a Mars Lumograph HB pencil, a POSCA paint pen in white, the Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolor travel set, and Pebeo Studio white gouache. As always, my first step was to transfer my initial sketch onto the watercolor paper using a light box. I noticed right away that this paper is much smoother than the other watercolor papers I've used. That makes sense seeing as it's hot press. It was so smooth, in fact, that it felt like drawing on printer paper, which evoked the sense memory of sitting on the living room floor, scrawling on the back of print advertisements as a child. The smoothness also made it easy to capture the details of my sketch, but I felt a little bit worried about how the color pencil was going to stick to it. I ended up crossing my fingers and hoped for the best. After taping the paper down, I started by swatching the colors to see how the paper reacted to water and pigment. I was curious to see if it was different than the Canson or Premier paper I used before, which are both 100% cellulose. The Fabriano Studio paper is 25% cotton in both the hot and cold press varieties. Like the Canson, the paint seemed to sit on top of the Fabriano instead of sinking in, but it also dried more evenly. However, there were still noticeable back runs and uneven texture throughout. My next tests were the 3 mini studies or thumbnails off to the side. I like doing these to figure out my color mixes and see how the paper reacts to wet on wet and wet on dry techniques. In my digital illustrations, I sometimes skip this step, but I found it essential in traditional media, especially transparent mediums like watercolor. The paper held up admirably and allowed me to lift and blot with a wet brush or towel without any of the dreaded pilling I experienced last week. After a few more tests off screen, I changed my mood from dubious to cautiously optimistic. Moving on to the final 5x7-inch study, which is slightly smaller than an A5, I started by laying down the lightest base tones for the figure and her clothing. Last week, the Canson could create decent washes in my thumbnails, but immediately fell apart when trying to cover larger areas. I was relieved to see that I could lay down flat colors on the Fabriano in areas larger than 1 square inch. The paper dried quicker than my old Premier pad, but slightly slower than the Canson XL. I appreciated this because it gave me time to move the paint around and blot some areas before they were dry. The first shadow pass on the skin also went well. I was able to blend the transition on the left cheek with a clean brush and paper towel. Since the paper dried relatively quickly, I could then lay down the green in her irises and the shadows of her jacket without worrying about bleeding between the areas. I dabbed the paper towel over the jacket to simulate the fleecy texture I saw in the photo. After a minute or so, things were dry enough to add deeper values with more concentrated pigment in her eyes, hat, and hair. I was feeling more confident by this point, so I started in with the value details. At first, things went well. I liked the rose I captured in the hat, which made it feel more like wool and gave it some texture. The scarf was also a joy to paint because I could soften the edges without worrying about the paper breaking down. One thing I would change, however, are the eyebrows. I was using a size 12 brush, but I think a smaller liner brush would have given me more control and saved me some of the correction work I had to do later on. When this shadow pass was fully dry, I started with my 3rd layer of color. Unfortunately, this is when things started to go wrong. The layers beneath this pass reactivated and began to lift in areas which showed me that there was a limit to how many passes of color I could use. I could still paint on top of these areas, but I couldn't make these places much darker since the paper wouldn't accept more pigment. At least, this didn't happen to the focal point, which was the face. I think it's because I was using diluted washes here and also limiting the number of brush strokes I used. When everything was dry, I could see and feel a chalky texture on her hair and hat, which is hard to see on camera. I've heard that cheaper watercolors usually have a chalky texture, but this was the first time I felt it for myself. I think the paper's smoothness combined with how much pigment I had layered on these areas made it noticeable. At this point, I decided to step away from the figure and work on the background instead. Since I pre-mixed all my colors, this was a relatively simple process of blocking in the base values. I was pleased to see that the snow itself flowed as one smooth wash instead of separating and revealing brush strokes, like the background from last week. I wish I had done a similar wash for the trees so that I had a soft, out-of-focus base to work on. Alas, I jumped straight into the details and paid for it. I immediately lost the luminance and started getting patchy values. In retrospect, besides starting with a lighter value, I should have also used a larger brush that could hold more water. I've done that technique on past studies, but I forgot about it this time after last week's struggle with just one flat wash of color. In the future, I think I need to pay more attention to my background process in the mini-study phase. I could have probably lifted the dark values and tried again, but I was worried about destroying the paper. Instead, I focused on solidifying the values that were there with another pass that helped eliminate some of the patchiness, but unfortunately not all of it. This did help the figure stand out though. Part of what drew me to the original photo was the sharp contrast between the light figure and the deep green of the forest behind her. It was hard to see if the figure's value range was correct until I could compare it to the background. Usually things end up too light, but actually this time I realized some of my values were too dark. I think I overcompensated in the hat and hair because I was trying to avoid the pale value issue I've had in most studies. While I could lift that color, I was still wary after last week, so I decided to save that for the dry media pass. The last step in the watercolor portion of the study was in the final value accents in the pupils and lashes. I usually do this with pencil because I have better control. This week, I took out my number 6 brush, made sure it had a fine tip, and carefully added these colors with watercolor. It was nerve-wracking to work on that scale with a medium I don't have great control over, but it made a big difference. Suddenly, her facial features had depth and form. I mustered up the courage to define her nose and the corners of her mouth as well before stepping back. I think the combination of a smaller detail brush, smooth paper, and more patience paid off, and this is actually my favorite watercolor pass on a study to date. There's still plenty of room for improvement, but the level of detail and value contrast made my next steps faster and easier. As always, I untaped the study and placed it at a 45-degree angle to add the final layers. I do this to make sure my figure construction stays solid and to help out my back. The watercolor phase went well, but the color pencil phase had some problems. Like the Canson, the white Polychromos didn't show up at all, except on the chalky areas where too much paint pigment had built up. I think the additional tooth here gave this transparent color something to grab onto. However, I quickly realized that I could only layer 3 or 4 colors in general on every part of the paper before it refused to accept more pigment. I suspected something like this might happen back when I first touched this paper. It was so smooth and had so little tooth that I worried only one layer of color pencil would work. Luckily, I had a little wiggle room with 3 layers, but I still ended up prioritizing value over color. Like I've mentioned before, capturing form is a matter of value, not hue or color. As long as I could lighten or darken areas to the right value, the study should still work. My black, magenta, walnut brown, and phthalo blue color pencils could cover the darkest areas, but there wasn't anything on the light end of the spectrum. The POSCA ended up doing most of the heavy lifting here because it was opaque and I could layer color on top of it. Unfortunately, this particular marker was dry, so I wasn't able to achieve smooth washes on the face. It did add a neat texture to the background though before it finally went completely dry. This marker has lasted me through 1 pen and ink sketchbook and 8 studies. I think I'll always have one on hand from now on. I eventually decided to finish up the bottom of the background first before trying to find a replacement for the white POSCA. Luckily, the pencil was able to layer more times over acrylic than just paper, so I got a lovely texture that resembled powdered snow for the ground. It's always interesting to render white objects and forms in studies because they pick up all the undertones and colors in the shadows and highlights. In the photo, it was a sunny day, which created warm highlights and cool shadows. This translated as almost a sky blue for these shadows, which makes sense, given the surroundings and how pure a white, fresh snow can be. I've often worked with these yellowish highlights and blue shadows in my digital art, so I'm familiar with this color scheme. Luckily, this gave me some brain space to think about my experience with mixed media. The rest of the color pencil process is the same as in previous studies, so I'll share my lessons in mixed media instead. I think the most important lesson I've internalized is patience. Watercolor isn't a medium I can rush through. Instead, I need to deliberately plan each step and color mixture ahead of time. In my first study, I didn't do this, which led to strange and muddy colors, blotchy texture, and low value contrast. I've slowly watched both my confidence and the amount of time I can spend in the watercolor phase grow because I learned how to slow down. I spent the least amount of time working in dry media this study because 70 to 80% of the rendering work was done in watercolor. In the beginning, I think I did maybe 20% of the rendering with watercolor, and that's if I'm being generous. These proportions have changed as I picked up new techniques and built on what I learned each week. The second lesson I learned more recently is that, at least for watercolor, paper really does make a difference. My philosophy is that good supplies are those you forget about as you use them. They don't get in your way, so you can focus on improving your craft and technique. The Canson XL paper fought me the entire study last week. This Fabriano paper did much better, but I still prefer that old discontinued pad I used to use because it could handle both watercolor and color pencil. I will be using this Fabriano pad up on studies though, but playing more to its strengths, which include more limited layers of wet media and less dry media overall. Hopefully this ends up improving my watercolor skills as I spend more time in this stage. The third lesson I learned was to be okay with being a beginner and to take joy in the small wins. I'm better with watercolor than I was in December, but I'm definitely still a beginner. I can see a large gap between what I want to create and my current skills, which can be frustrating, but also liberating. There's a certain joy that comes when you accept that you're not great at something. This gives you permission to experiment, and each small win feels that much sweeter. This time, adding the little fuzzy strands at the edge of her hat and hair felt immensely satisfying. Since the paint was chalky here, the pencil could grip on, and this small texture detail immediately made the hat feel like wool and differentiated it from the rest of her clothing. The last lesson I want to mention is my grasp of color theory. I learned most of what I know about color theory using digital art. This way helped save money on supplies and gave me a portable way to study with my iPad, but there were some aspects I didn't fully understand until I was forced to mix my own colors with a limited palette. In digital art, every color imaginable is available to you on a color wheel, but in traditional art, you have to create these colors yourself. I've found that I'm much more sensitive to color temperature, slight value shifts, and the way color relativity works than I was before, because I've had to sharpen my observational skills through color mixing. I think if I had no knowledge, this would have been intimidating, but since I knew the basic theory coming into this, it ended up being a way to deepen and solidify my knowledge base. I'd recommend you try something similar if you're like me and learned how to render digitally. Anyway, going back to this week's study, I finally came up with a solution to the light value problem: gouache. I've used white gouache before, but this was the first time I used it as a substitute for the POSCA pen. It layered well over both pencil and watercolor and did exactly what I needed it to do. I used it to soften the transitions between light and shadow on her face, add bounce light to her jacket, and pick out form in the background trees. While working on the background, I noticed that pencil doesn't blend very well on this paper. In previous studies, I was able to lay down a layer of pencil and then smooth away the individual strokes with a blending stump, finger, or paper towel. I couldn't do that here. This added interesting texture in areas like the snow, but also meant I had to be careful rendering blurry, soft areas like the trees. It took some finessing, but eventually I got into a rhythm and completed the study. Here's the final result. While parts of the process were still frustrating, overall I much prefer Fabriano Studio paper to Canson XL. There's a good chance I'll be finishing this pad in studies, but for now I have one more paper to test. This Friday, I'll be using Arch's 100% cotton watercolor hot press paper and talking about overcoming the fear of using expensive or professional grade supplies. See you then, and as always, I hope you make something that brings you joy this week. Bye!